Good morning, everyone. She may only be a child, but clearly she has a very grown-up message, one that we're going to talk about this morning. As you saw from those stark video images, there are an alarming number of people around the world for which climate change is not merely a future idea or a threat, it's impacting their everyday lives. It's forcing them from their homes, from the places that they've lived for generations. It's the stuff, frankly, that keeps me awake at night. And it is truly an existential threat for some of these communities, and we have some represented here, and I'm thrilled that you're all here to listen to their stories. Next to me is Patricia Cochran. She's the Executive Director of the Alaska Native Science Commission. She bears witness every day to the effects of Arctic warming and that impact on her communities and how huge they are every day in the lives of Alaska's native communities. To her right is Pelenise Alofa. She's the national coordinator of the Kiribati Climate Action Network from all the way on the other side of the global story. Here she is from Kiribati, the island nation in the Pacific, one of 33, she reminded me, that dot the equator, where the rising ocean levels threaten to drown her entire country, literally under melting water within the next 30 years or so. We're talking about a generation. And to her right is Mary Robinson, we must all know. In addition to being the former president of Ireland, Mary served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change. And now she heads the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, a center for leadership and advocacy for people most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change around the world. Thank you, ladies, for joining us today. So ask yourself, what's the first image that comes to mind when you think of climate change? We think of polar bears and ice caps. But today, I want to bring your focus and your thoughts, your energy, and your passion towards the people, those people who are already struggling with the cataclysmic effects of climate change. I want to start off the discussion with Mary so you can set the framework of the discussion for us. We're here at Women in the World.
Yeah.
Why in the world is climate change a women's issue?
In fact, I think the real image of climate change is a woman's face. And she's worried and she's trying to cope. She's trying to cope with the fact that everything is changing for the worse. I came to climate change as a human rights issue because I saw, mainly in African countries, I talked to farmers, the majority of them women, and they couldn't put food on the table because they couldn't sow because the rainy seasons weren't coming when they should, or they had long periods of drought and then flash flooding in Uganda. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf would tell me in Liberia that when she was growing up, she could predict the rainy seasons. Now, as president of her country, she doesn't know when to plan her road building, when her infrastructure. It is a huge issue, and it's all about the need to cope with the shocks and become more resilient. And it's women in the households and women in communities who are the real agents of change, like these two women that we have on the panel, and who are picking up the pieces of this very real threat to human rights, and as you say, existential threat. Right. We're not on course for a safe world. The governments of the world have agreed we have to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. At the moment, we're heading for 4 degrees or more. And the World Bank did a report a couple of years ago called Turn Down the Heat, showing how catastrophic that would be. And we would be facing worse than our two champions here, who are coping in a much more real way. It would be more floods, more hurricanes, more sea level rise, wiping out complete cities, including here in the United States. So this is a big threat.
It is a huge threat, and women end up coping, as you say. Patricia, I feel like you brought a burst of Arctic air with you. It's cold today, and you're dressed appropriately. I feel as though, representing the Native peoples from where you come, you've survived in the harshest environments for thousands of years. Give us a sense of the impact of climate change on the people that you see day to day.
Well, first of all, thank you, New York, for making the weather appropriate for my attire. I do appreciate that. In my community, if you'll let me digress for just a moment, I need to set some protocols. And in my community, it's important for me to, first of all, recognize that there are Indigenous people of these very homelands that we stand upon today, and for me to recognize and honor the tribal people whose lands we occupy today. I also want to I also want to make sure that I give great honor and respect to my elders who are here today, and to bring to all of us the remembrance of our ancestors. For us in our communities, it's really important to follow those protocols and to remember where we come from and why we are the people that we are. So I'm here today to hopefully to bring a little bit of the human element so people can see the faces and understand the kinds of issues that we're going through in Alaska, in the Arctic, and indeed in indigenous communities and communities across the world. First of all, in the Arctic, in Alaska, we've been facing these issues for many, many years. It's taken science quite a long time to catch up to what the traditional knowledge, what our communities have been saying for decades. For at least the last 40 or 50 years, our communities have noticed the subtlest of changes because they live very closely tied to the land. They see when there are changes that are happening in the environment around them. And for us, in reality, we are now beginning to lose communities. We're certainly losing lives, that there's hardly one of us in many of our communities who doesn't know someone who's gone out hunting or fishing on the ice and simply never returned home again. So it's more than just a discussion for us. It's reality. It's something that we live with and face every single day and have for decades.
And you've literally seen homes fall into the ice.
Absolutely. We're losing homes. We have at least 7 communities right now in Alaska that have been designated that we know that they're having to move right now as we speak. Several of them have moved inland already because they're losing 50 to 100 feet of land every year. The erosion is happening throughout all of our communities now. 85% of our communities in Alaska are coastal communities. So when you look at the possibility of that happening to that many communities, displacing that many people, it really becomes much more of an everyday reality.
I am so honored that you're both here. And Pelenise is, I feel like the two of you are representing communities that are canaries in the coal mine. And tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in Kiribati and what it's like there, the problem of climate change and how it's affecting the people.
First of all, I'd like to say Mary from Kiribati and from the Pacific. And thank you, New York, for bringing a Pacific Islander to your country. And the hospitality here is good. And thank you so much. And what's happening in the islands is exactly what she's saying, the coastal erosion. You know, the land is already small. We have narrow islands and very low. When I say low, it's only 3 feet above sea level. And narrow can be narrow where you stand here. This is the size of some parts of the land. You see the lagoon and you see the oceans on one side. If you're tired of swimming here, you run to the other side and swim. But what's happening is, with the coastal erosion, our islands are getting smaller, and people, we have people who are losing homes. And they just don't move. They said, where do we move to? We just have wait for the tide to go down and build again. Or they just let the tide go under their houses and they still remain where they are.
Tell us about how the water can be contaminated by one rogue wave and garbage streaming up onto the shores.
Yes, we have, all the time we have king tides. And it happened just recently, like February, and then March. In February, we have a high tide. A normal day like this, no storm, just sunshine, a beautiful day. And they said, the tide is coming up. Will come up today. And we said, it's a normal day, the tide will come up. But when it came up above our seawalls and went over right to the homes of people and brought everything in the ocean with it. And for me, as a Kiribati, I ran to go and see, and to take pictures. And is this real? Is this a real high tide? A normal day. Normally we have high tide and king tides, but this is just a high tide. No, that is more scary because it's normal day. And the water came up all the way to people's homes and bringing up everything. Even the ships that are wrecked in the ocean brought them up right to the coast. And you just stood there and you wait and you say, this is real. And this is, if it continues to be this way every month, what do we do?
Mary, I want to bring you in on this conversation. Tell us a little bit about, I mean, you talk about climate justice. Tell me about the legal framework and how you're trying to use the issue as a human rights issue.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, the stories we just heard are from peoples who have not caused the problem. And that's part of the injustice. It's the most vulnerable countries. I was with the president of Kiribati recently on a panel in Geneva, and he spoke movingly about his responsibility. He has bought land in Fiji as a kind of reserve because he's worried. If we don't stay enough below 2 degrees, indeed down to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and he doesn't see the leadership at the moment, he's urging it. Now, we were in Geneva, where I served as UN High Commissioner for 5 years, and I remember Eleanor Roosevelt and the wonderful commission that drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They never imagined that human-induced climate change, because that's what it is, it's our lifestyles based on fossil fuel, oil and coal and gas, is causing this problem, that it might put whole countries out of existence. And what will it mean if the people move to Fiji? Will they still be a sovereign people with sovereign rights? Will they still be a member of the United Nations? And we don't have a framework for those who are already displaced. About 2% of the population of the world is being displaced by climate. It's envisaged that by 2050, which is 35 years away, we could have 200 million climate-displaced people, which is about the migration population of the world at the moment.
Right.
So all that we see, I mean, I'm ashamed as a European when I see these boatloads of people dying, coming across from Northern Africa, from Libya in particular, trying to get to Europe, trying to avoid conflict, to avoid terrible hardship and human rights issues, and they die on the way. We need to have a much more of a human rights approach and policy, and we must realize that we need to deal with becoming a carbon-free world, at least by 2050, carbon-free, or we will condemn people to have to move, and we still have no framework for them.
Pelenise, while we're talking about this idea of migration, the president of your country, Kiribati, has made this plan to have you migrate with dignity to Fiji. I know you don't necessarily see it as the answer, especially because of the implications for leaving your ancestry behind.
When you talk about migration, it's almost a no-no thing for our people. It's hard to leave. You have a connection to your land. Like when we did a survey and we asked some people and they said, maybe the young people can go. For us old people, we stay. Our loved ones, we look after the loved ones that are buried here. No, we say we all move together. Migration with dignity, we move together as a family, but we cannot, leave some behind. But we will leave some behind because they will not move. So our government has so many plans for the migration, not because they want people to move, but prepare people. You need to prepare people emotionally.
As well as job training
and not
skills.
Just, yes, we do a lot of job training in Kiribati right now, and there's a lot of job opportunities and training that are coming from the regional NGOs and regional institutions like USP, South Pacific, University of the South Pacific, and the SPC, the South Pacific Commission, the community. They have projects that are preparing our people right now. We call them Pacific Tibet, vocational training for our young people. So if we are training people at the top level, we need a lot of people that are going to be left behind if they are not trained, or they wouldn't be able to migrate and find jobs. So these projects are coming in to help them, for the next maybe 10 or 30 years before we move, at least there should be preparation done in Kiribati.
Patricia, give us some insights into what's going on in some of these communities. We talk about a town like Nutak, right, where living conditions are quite deplorable, and people are already beginning to move. Give us a sense of what that's like.
Newtok is a little community that's in the south, in the western part of the state of Alaska, and they've actually been in the process of moving over the last 10 years. They're one of those communities that has indeed been losing up to 100 feet of land. They've lost homes, they've lost infrastructure, their entire sewer and water system has been destroyed. There's really little left for them and little choice for them to do anything other than move. So about 10 years ago, they traded some land with the Department of Interior, land a little higher up and a little more further inland, and they've started the process now of moving themselves. But I'll tell you, the sad news is there just really isn't anybody out there who's willing to write a check for $500,000 for a village of 200 people or less to move.
Right.
And that's the reality that these communities face.
Well, give us a sense. I mean, this is an area with no running water anymore. What is the response been like by the American government, by NGOs, others?
Well, very little, unfortunately. And that's part of the issue, that everything, and our federal government really sort of demands a lot of steps have to happen before you can move. You can't move until you have an airstrip. You can't get an airstrip until you have a post office. You can't get a school until there's a million things that you have to go through to move this small community of people. And those kinds of infrastructure things just aren't there.
Right.
So that's the problem. So these people have really taken it upon themselves to begin to move their own community. They've begun some pioneering efforts to trade off their own land so they could get into a safer location further inland.
Mary, give us some context. What are the legal rights of these folks who are being forced to migrate?
Yeah. The context, in fact, and this is the reason why I'm so pleased that Women in the World has had this session and sees it as a women's issue. The context is the importance of this year, 2015. In this year, the world will make huge decisions about future development, and it has to be sustainable. It has to be sustainable with our world, as we've heard from two Indigenous representatives who really understand this. In July, we will have a meeting on financing for development and the need of more support to developing countries. In September, governments will adopt the Sustainable Development Goals for all countries. And this is a new thing. The Millennium Development Goals were only for developing countries. The Sustainable Development Goals will be for all countries because no country in the world at the moment has sustainable development. No country. We all have to learn, and we have to learn to rapidly reduce our emissions, to use energy in a different way, to change our behavior. And who changes behavior? In a home, in a community. Women will have a huge role to play in leadership. And then we have in December the climate agreement, which we have to adopt, which will be binding and keep us on a pathway to below 2 degrees Celsius. And for that we need leadership. And the leadership is not too evident. Yes, President Obama is giving good leadership, and Secretary of State Kerry. It's good that the Chinese and the United States have come together and issued a joint communique. European Union has been giving leadership, reducing by 40% by 2030, and good standards on efficiency and on renewables. But it's not enough. All the scientists are telling us, and the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in very important reports last year, warned us that we're not on course for a safe world. So this is a huge threat to those who are already being displaced. And we don't have, like the Refugee Convention. The International Bar Association is looking at this, and there's a Nansen group that have been looking at it. But it's a much, much more urgent and important issue than we've realized so far.
Pelenise, tell us a little bit about the seawalls that you're having to continually build. And I know that you talked about the regular flooding that takes place, but recently Cyclone Pam came through and really wreaked a lot of havoc in that area, especially on those gardens that you'd been planting.
Yes, we have a project that we help women in planting. They have their household farms. And one of the things that they reported straight after the cyclone and that flooding in February was, all our gardens are gone. And what do? Replant again? And that's the life of our people. Disaster comes and they continue to live the same way.
And you build the seawall,
And
and then it
building the
gets flooded.
seawalls and gardening. Building the seawalls, but when the water comes in, it contaminates the water wells, because we live, almost every home must have a water well. And that's what they live with. But when it's contaminated, it's a big problem. So I talked about a woman that continues to build her seawall. It's not her husband, not her children. She was worried that, while they go to sleep, the water will come and just wash them away. So she made sure during Cyclone Pam that she was out there building the seawall. And I give my hat to her and said, "You're a mother. That's why you care for your children. You are out there in the sun and in the rain building that seawall." And so many people are building seawalls every time the tide comes up, because he just washed everything away. And what do? You get up and rebuild. That's your life.
Patricia, I want you to jump in, if you will. This idea that you mentioned that there are good intentions, but not a lot of action on the parts of governments and NGOs. What does self-reliance mean to you in relation to traditional knowledge?
Well, in our communities, to be quite honest with you, self-reliance is something we've had for generations. It's the reason that we've been able to live and survive in the harshest of conditions, in the worst of places, because we really are very adaptable people, very resilient people. We've learned to be very self-reliant. As I tell people, our grocery store, our Safeway store is right outside. When you open your door, that's where we go shopping. And so we live very closely tied to the environment, where we have to have that. I wanted to make one quick comment about the seawall, because we're having exactly the same kinds of issues in Alaska and have been for many, many years. My hometown in Nome has had a seawall built there for over my lifetime, all of the time that I've lived there. And that's because there's no longer the ice, the sea ice that used to form in front of all of our villages. It is what kept us safe. Now those ice conditions have changed so much that the erosion is happening, the flooding is happening, because that ice is no longer there.
And you were talking about the thinning ice for the hunters who were using motorized sleds, but now I understand you're going to more traditional route.
Well, I think a lot of people are understanding that a number of things. Number one, we used dog teams for many, 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 many years. There are really good reasons for us to use dog teams, because the dogs are very smart, and they will stop you before you get out on those very bad ice conditions. The snow machine will not do that for you.
Right.
So a lot of my young nephews and other people are really going back much more to looking at our traditional ways, because there's great reasons for us to use that traditional knowledge that has kept us alive for all these centuries. Our traditional medicines that are still things that are in effect now. The kinds of buildings, why we built in the way that we did, facing the directions that we did, so we'd know the weather and how it would be moved, how the winds would change. Subterranean communities, there were all very good traditional knowledge reasons for living the way we did.
Subterraneanly, well, that's amazing. Mary, give us a sense of which levers do you pull? Is it the moral imperative that you appeal to? Is it the self-interest? Is it just a multilateral developmental goal? How do you get people to move, and governments for that matter?
Yeah. It is all of that, but the moral imperative to me is very strong. Think about it. Those very poor communities and families who have not used fossil fuel, who have lived for centuries, their families have lived for centuries with an even climate situation that they lived by and coped with, are now finding themselves facing climate shocks they never understood, never in their history. And so as we move, as we must, to a low-carbon world, they must be prioritized in clean energy, in support for adaptation, in support sometimes for loss and damage when it goes beyond adaptation. And in fact, we kind of planned, and I'd like to do it, that we would stand together. We four would stand together, and I want everybody to get up and stand, because I want to explain why. Stand up, everybody. I was president of my country for 7 years. I did serve as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. In fact, at the moment, I'm the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on climate change. But I'm a mother of 3, and I'm a grandmother. I'm an Irish grandmother. I have 5 grandchildren, and they are between the ages of 11 and 1. Those grandchildren will be in their 40s in 2050. No, actually, the 1-year-old will only be 35 in 2050. And I wonder what they will think about us, what they will say about us, about what we did or didn't do in 2015. It's as important as that. If we don't take the right steps in 2015, they are entitled to be so angry with us because we failed them. We condemned them to a very troubled, catastrophic world. Who wants to do that for their children? And that's why the intergenerational justice is also very important. And this is truly a women's issue. And this is an issue that truly needs more leadership this year. So the reason I've asked you to stand is I want each of us to think, what is one thing that we can do going out of this conference, Women in the World, to help to mobilize leadership for financing for development in July, for the need to have a really robust, sustainable development goals, that one of which is on climate change, that sort of change the whole way of thinking about development, and then that we have a climate agreement in Paris that is binding, that changes things. And we need to think, you said, is it self-interest, is it solidarity? In 1945, which is the year that I compare to 2015, the world came together because we'd had 2 world wars, we'd had a Holocaust, we'd opened up a divide between the world, the Soviet world and the Cold War. And so people were driven by this sense, never again. And they came together and they forged the Charter of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, a Marshall Plan for Europe, an incredible commitment to the future, and a few years later at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so we're in this extraordinary time when we need a leadership. Yes, there are all the crises that we know about, but this is the existential threat. And existential means something. It means that we are the first generation to fully understand the dangers of climate change. I know there are still a few climate deniers, but they're very much on the back foot. This is an issue that we have to take incredibly seriously. We're the first generation to fully understand the seriousness of climate change, and the last generation with time to do something about it. So think of Patricia, think of Pelenise, think about that. It's incredibly serious. And I just hope that among all the other things that you've been inspired by at this Women in the World, that this is the issue, because this is the year. If we miss the opportunities this year, we will not be answerable. Sometimes I even hear the voices of my grandchildren, who will be in their 40s in 2050, sharing the world with 9 billion other people. 9 billion other people means feeding 9 billion other people. It means water for 9 billion people. It means all of the things that are being constrained by climate change. And we have a new climate economy report that says it's in the interest of every country to move rapidly. California is giving great example here in the United States, a state that's moving in the right direction and moving fast. You all have to become more California here in the United States, and we have to become better in Europe, and everybody has to become better, because this is the existential threat, and it's a women's issue beyond all. So we stand together on this issue. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I can think of no better leaders than the 3 women I'm standing here with today. Your leadership is so valuable. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your wisdom with the women in the world.
Okay.
Thank you.